Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the University of Minnesota's Human Rights Program, I'm pleased to welcome you all to the annual Scallen Lecture in Human Rights with our special guest, Mary Lawlor. My name is Aisha Hersey, and I'm an undergraduate senior studying political science and one of the Hrant Dink Human Rights Scholars this year with the Human Rights Program. The Scallen Lecture series came about because of the generous donation of Stephen and Shaki Scallen to the university's College of Liberal Arts. The Scallens' abiding interest in human rights and cultural awareness came out of their first-hand experience with descendants of the Armenian genocide. The Scallens established a lecture to explore the erasure of cultures, which takes many forms, and to examine the role of corruption in the challenge of human rights. In bringing the Scallens' gift to the university here at the University of Minnesota, we have framed the Human Rights Lecture Series as one of principled voices, a way of highlighting those leaders and thinkers who distinguish themselves by carrying out their passion for human rights, cultural awareness, democratic principles, fairness, and dignity, often at great personal risk and sometimes at great odds. We are honored to welcome Mary Lawlor as our esteemed guest, who embodies these qualities and whose work inspires us to advocate for the human rights and dignity of all. Thank you.
Good afternoon. It is an honor to be here today. My name is Beata Coons, and I am a second-year Master of Human Rights student. I am the president of the Gender, Sexuality, and Policy Event Committee and the role of Health, Accessibility, and Wellness Officer of the Public Affairs Student Association within Humphrey. I'm grateful for the opportunity to be here and to learn from Mary Lawlor's important work. We begin by acknowledging that the land on which we gather is the unceded traditional, ancestral, and contemporary territory of the Dakota and Ojibwe peoples. We honor the enduring relationship these indigenous communities have with this land and recognize their ongoing presence, resilience, and stewardship. We commit to supporting efforts of reparative justice to address the long-lasting impacts of the genocidal efforts to forcibly remove them from these lands. We also acknowledge the broader history of oppression and exploitation that undergirds this institution, including the fact that this college, like many in the United States, was built in part on the labor of enslaved people. This acknowledgement is not only a recognition of the past, but a call to confront and address the ongoing systems of racial and economic injustice, including prison slavery, that continue to shape our society today. As we gather for this event, we commit ourselves to learning from history, working collectively toward the abolition of systems that perpetuate oppression, and the protection of the defenders of human rights. Thank you.
Good afternoon, and welcome to the Humphrey School of Public Affairs. I am Associate Dean for Faculty Yingling Fan. Dean Bochway at Humphrey School today couldn't be here with you today, so she sends her regards. It is an honor to host this important conversation alongside our colleagues in the College of Liberal Arts and the Human Rights Program. The Humphrey School is proud to be a global leader in human rights education and policy. Through our Master of Human Rights program, which we co-administer with the College of Liberal Arts, students from around the world prepare to become advocates, policymakers, and scholars advancing justice and human dignity. They work directly with the organizations protecting refugees, advancing gender equity, and defending free expression. Their learning and their leadership reflects the university's deep commitment to human rights in practice, not just in principle. This work is part of what we call our constellations of impact, the areas where the Humphrey School faculty, students, and alumni shine together to create change across the world. One of these constellations, human rights and humanitarianism, reflects our enduring belief that dignity and justice are foundational to public life. Today's gathering is a living expression of that commitment. Our namesake, Hubert H. Humphrey, reminded us that the moral test of government is how it treats those who are in the dawn of life, the children, those who are in the twilight of life, the aged, and those who are in the shadows of life, the sick, the needy, and the handicapped. That conviction that government and public life must protect human dignity is what brings us together today. We are honored to welcome Ms. Mary Lawlor, whose lifelong commitment to protecting those who protect others embodies the spirit of courage and public purpose that defines this school. On behalf of the Humphrey School and the University of Minnesota, thank you for joining us in this vital dialogue. It is now my pleasure to turn to my colleague, Dean Avelas of the College of Liberal Arts. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am Dershon Aviles, Dean of the College of Liberal Arts, and it's a privilege actually to get to welcome you on behalf of the college and to join my colleague Ying Fan from Humphrey and our partners in the Humphrey School in hosting this important gathering. I also want to take a moment to thank our students who are here helping us begin this event, Aisha and Beta, is that right? Yeah. And everyone, all the staff who helped put this together, and I also want to take a moment and thank our director, Carrie Booth-Walling, who is a visionary and leads the center beautifully. The College of Liberal Arts is very proud to be the home of the Human Rights Program, which stands as an interdisciplinary hub for the vital work we're going to hear more about today, the kind of work we're here about today. Human rights scholarship and advocacy thrive when people from across disciplines come together to ask hard questions, amplify unheard voices, and imagine better futures for everyone. For everyone. That spirit of collaboration and engagement is at the heart of CLE's strategic plan, Compass 2030, and it also aligns with the university's broader mission of public and community engagement. Minnesota itself has a remarkable tradition of human rights leadership, from grassroots organizers and indigenous advocates to global institutions headquartered right here. Importantly, that tradition reminds us that the defense of human rights begins close to home, in the daily work of people and communities who insist on dignity and justice for all. Ms. Lawlor's visit honors and continues that legacy. Her commitment to protecting the right to defend human rights, especially among grassroots activists and frontline defenders, challenges us to think about what it truly means to stand with those who stand up. I would also like to thank, I will continue the thanking of the Scallen family, Stephen and Shockey Scallen, for their enduring support of this work through the Scallen Fund, which continues to highlight and strengthen the voices of human rights defenders. We are honored to welcome Ms. Lawlor to the University of Minnesota, and we look forward to learning from her insights and experiences. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for being here. My name is Talok Pechu, and I am an undergraduate student here at the University of Minnesota under the College of Liberal Arts. I'm currently pursuing a Bachelor of Art in Sociology of Law, Criminology, and Justice with minors in Spanish and Psychology. I also serve as the advocacy coordinator for the United Nations Student Association here on campus, and I'm part of the working group for the Human Rights Program. Today we're joined by Ms. Mary Lawlor, who is the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Human Rights Defenders since May 2020. She is currently an adjunct professor of business and human rights in the Centre for Social Innovation, School of Business, Trinity College, Dublin. Ms. Lawlor has worked extensively with and on the situation of human rights defenders. In 2001, she founded Frontline Defenders, the International Foundation for the Protection of Human Rights Defender, to concentrate on human rights defender at risk. As executive director from 2001 to 2016, Ms. Lawlor presented Frontline Defenders and had a key role in the organization's development. Ms. Lawlor was previously the director of Irish section of Amnesty International from 1988 to 2000. Ms. Lawlor is on the advisory board of the Centre for Ethics in Public Life, School of Philosophy, University College, Dublin. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Ms. Lawlor.
So, thank you all very much. I'm delighted to be here in Minnesota to give this Stephen and Shaki Scallen Lecture in Human Rights. And it's my first time in these twin cities. So in addition to thanking the benefactors of this series, I would like to express my thanks to the University of Human Rights Program, the Humphrey School of Public Affairs, and the Institute for Global Studies for coming together to host me, as well as to the co-sponsoring organizations for this afternoon's event. And I particularly want to thank the young people here who spoke, because, you know, you are the hope for humanity. And it is, the adults, you know, have got it wrong in so many ways, so you just have to pick it up and get with it. So this is my 50th year in human rights advocacy, and for roughly half that time, I have been focusing specifically on the protection of human rights defenders. That is, people who promote and protect the rights of others, and often at great personal cost. This trajectory helped me to take a long view as I surveyed the state of human rights and the international human rights system today. There is an undeniable disillusionment with the international human rights architecture as it currently exists. It has proven largely incapable of protecting the world's most vulnerable people, including civilians in wars, refugees, and human rights defenders exposing abuses, not to mention indigenous peoples and women and LGBT activists and others. The proliferation of armed conflict around the world feeds into this disillusionment. Indeed, there are more armed conflicts now taking place than at any other time since the Second World War. Human rights defenders in Yemen, in Ethiopia, in Sudan, in Myanmar, in Ukraine, in Haiti, and in the DRC, and many other places, are being attacked and killed with impunity. This is happening because they are documenting human rights violations or delivering humanitarian assistance to the civilian population, or providing gender-based violence services to traumatized women and girls, and among other services. Populations are being brutalized in largely forgotten conflicts, while those who try to seek refuge elsewhere, as is their right under international law, are being demeaned, detained, and deported. The long-awaited, criminally overdue ceasefire in Gaza brought some rare welcome news, and the celebration of civilians both in the streets of Gaza and Israel offered some brief respite after 2 years of harrowing images and stories. The unforgivable attacks by Hamas on Israelis on October the 7th, 2023 were a war crime, and any surviving architects or participants of that day of humanity belong in The Hague before the International Criminal Court. The scale of slaughter which followed, the indiscriminate killing and the indiscriminate leveling of hospitals, schools, and homes, coupled with the support of countries which for the past quarter of the century had been among the most vocal in championing international human rights standards, have left us with a system that is creaking under the weight of its own hypocrisy. That a situation which appears to have reached the threshold of genocide could have been permitted to last for so long in full view of the world further undermines the legitimacy of the rules-based international order. Numerous human rights defenders have expressed to me disgust at this. One from Algeria recently said, "When grave violations are met with silence, double standards, or political compromise, defenders begin to question whether the principles of universality and accountability truly apply to all." This credibility crisis has been exacerbated by massive cuts in funding. The countries which have spoken about most and spent most on developing a national human rights infrastructure are now abandoning or deprioritizing it, choosing instead to direct resources into weapons, security, or defense. The current US administration has led the way in this, with the huge reductions in US aid that will impact most negatively, as it always does, on women, on LGBT persons, and on minorities. But it is not just the USA that is turning away from human rights funding. It is the UK, the Netherlands, France, Germany, Sweden, and Switzerland. They have all announced reductions in their overseas development assistance budgets. This deprioritization is happening at a time when rights in every region of the world are being rolled back as governments seek to limit the potential of citizens to pursue accountability and uphold justice. We are seeing renewed attacks on the rights of women, on LGBT persons, and on minorities, while at the international level, the language used to articulate human rights is being majorly challenged by Russia, by China, and now by the US, in an apparent attempt to erase some of the progress made on the rights of those whose voices are never heard. Restrictive legislation continues to bounce from country to country, designed to hamstring human rights defenders. Draft NGO laws are becoming commonplace. In the past year, they were introduced in Rwanda, in Zambia, in Paraguay, in Venezuela, and Tunisia alone. And such laws give government extensive oversight on the management of non-profit organizations and allow for wide grounds to refuse their licensing. For example, Article 7 of the draft NGO law in Rwanda states that non-profits may be refused permission to register if there is, and I quote, evidence indicating that the applicant organization is harming or intends to harm security, peace, health, unity of Rwandans, public order, good morals, or the rights and freedoms of others. Whatever all that means, it's very vague. Foreign agent laws also continue to be introduced, as seen recently in Georgia and in Serbia, and these laws require human rights defenders and organizations which receive funding from abroad, a right protected under the UN Declaration on Human Rights Defenders, to register or to label themselves as agents of foreign influence, as if human rights are a foreign concept. National security or counter-terror legislation are widely deployed to arrest activists. There is an ever-growing tendency for governments to conflate the promotion and protection of human rights of minority communities with terrorism. Some of these global trends may already be recognizable here, and others, I worry, may emerge in the coming weeks, months, or years. Even before the current administration took power, my colleagues in the UN Special Procedures and I raised concerns multiple times about growing restrictions on freedom of assembly and expression of human rights defenders in the USA. This was most notable during the crackdown on pro-Palestinian protests in university campuses last year, but it also extended to indigenous peoples' protests and peaceful protests against climate change. I was in New York last week to present my report to the General Assembly on human rights defenders working on climate change, in which I highlighted the growing trend of activists involved in non-violent environmental protests being criminalized and worse. At a side event I organized to launch the report, one of the speakers I invited was Alec Cannon. Alec was arrested last year for holding an umbrella over a fellow climate activist called John, who is a grandfather, John was playing the cello. He was playing Bach outside Citibank headquarters. The two were part of a gathering which had assembled to call on the bank to divest from fossil fuels. They had, the fossil fuel industry, obviously. They had previously been instructed to stay away from the bank after a security guard filed assault charges against them relating to a prior sit-in, charges which were dropped by the plaintiff after the plaintiff refused or failed to submit a deposition. And it just struck me, how ironic is it that in the US, two peaceful people could be arrested for asking a bank to divest from fossil fuel industry and who were just playing the cello and having an umbrella held over them. And I say to myself, what is the purpose of such an arrest? Other than to try and exercise a chilling effect on the right to peaceful protest. And also, how is the public interest being served here? I wrote to the government, the US government in this case, but didn't get a response. In fact, none of the 10 letters that I have written to the US government have received responses. Although the current administration has chosen to largely disengage with the UN mechanisms, as long as the US remains party to the human rights treaties and covenants which shape international human rights law, the UN will not disengage with it. Since the current administration took power, we have continued to raise the targeting of peaceful pro-Palestinian protesters, as well as defenders of the rights of migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers. We have also seen this year an increase in the number of people in the US submitting complaints to our mechanisms, looking to have their voices heard and to tap into the solidarity that exists in the international human rights movement. One such human rights defender recently wrote to me saying that one of the biggest threats that they face is the deliberate distortion of what human rights work actually is. She continued, in a country where the public has never been taught to recognize human rights, let alone defend them, it becomes dangerously easy to dismiss the work as partisan, simply using the language of dignity, of justice, or inclusion is enough to be accused of pushing a political agenda. This is taking place against a backdrop of fading freedoms, which President Trump is orchestrating in a manner that brings me to mind of Viktor Orban in Hungary and Alexander Vučić in Serbia. The targeting of immigrants, the erosion of academic freedom, the stigmatization of the LGBT community, the dismantling of anti-discrimination policies, the backsliding on reproductive rights, all of these point to attempts to silence difference, difference of opinion, difference of skin color, and difference of sexuality, to shoehorn what an American looks like into the MAGA straitjacket. Whenever I see such policies, I am reminded of the words of John Hume, the Nobel Peace Prize winner from Northern Ireland, a man who did so much to end the 30-year-old conflict there. He said, "Difference is the essence of humanity. It should never be the source of hatred or conflict." I mentioned at the beginning that because I started this work in the 70s, I tend to take a long view when considering the current context. My experience has taught me that the development of human rights is not linear. There are always peaks and troughs, and that in each of the last decades, we have seen that they have had their own human rights catastrophes. It is undeniable that we are in one of those troughs now, where deadly conflict, double standards, democratic decline, and funding deficits are combining to pose a question on whether we are entering into an anti-rights phase, whether the protections put in place over the last 50 years now risk being torn down. This was clearly in the mind of the UN Secretary General when he warned last year that we cannot accept a world in which the grandmothers fear that their granddaughters will enjoy fewer rights than they had. When confronted with these types of questions, I think about the hundreds and hundreds of human rights defenders I have had the good fortune to meet down the years. And I think about their resilience and that they've shown in the face of grave injustice. And I remember one of the people who brought me into human rights. He was an elderly man in the Amazon. His name was Brother Hector. And he was sitting there in front of me, telling me about the atrocities being done to the indigenous people in the Amazon. And as he was telling me, he half lifted out of the chair. And when he realized it, he sat down and he said, "Forgive me, it's the Spirit talking." And that is what I think it is about human rights defenders. They're unquenchable spirits, even in the face of desperation and danger. That got and still gets to me. It is also why I think no matter how strong this pushback is on human rights, it will not be successful in breaking the spirit of human rights defenders. Human rights defenders have a profound understanding of how human rights are woven into and inseparable from daily living. Not in the gift of government to give, but in the entitlement of people to claim. I return to what human rights defenders have achieved since the 1998 Declaration on Human Rights Defenders, and I continually find a sense of renewal. My report to the UN Human Rights Council in 2023 was on successes of human rights defenders, and it was to mark the small and the big successes that human rights defenders have achieved since the Declaration, and how they have contributed to a fairer, a more equal, and a more just society, often, as we all know, putting themselves in danger to help realize rights for others. And these stories that I told in that report range from a children's organization in Bangladesh who had worked with the local commissioner there and succeeded in stopping a dozen forced marriages. And in Yemen, women, the abductee mothers, they call themselves, and they talked to both sides of the conflict, and they succeeded in finding where their loved ones were, whether alive or dead, and reuniting those who had died so that the families would have a grave to mourn on. And I think in Ireland, in my own country, where for so long there were very few rights, in the last decade we have had equal marriage, and we have had greater reproductive rights for women. And this was all driven by civil society and human rights defenders. So yes, the international system designed to protect and promote rights is badly damaged. But regardless of whether such a system exists or not, I know human rights defenders and those that defend rights will continue their work at local levels, even in the most difficult of circumstances. They defend rights not because they defend rights because they believe it is the right thing to do. And they believe in the promise of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. While some may no longer hold faith in the system, they hold true to the values embodied in the Declaration. And it is no exaggeration to say that there are more people working in human rights now than ever before, and in more countries than ever before. And they are ready for a fight. I just look at the example of how women in Afghanistan continue to run underground schools, continue to protest against the Taliban, and continue to get information out to the wider world, despite the Taliban's best interest to terrorize them and remove them completely from public life. One organization recently wrote to me, and I leave it here, grassroots civil society organizations have helped to mitigate some of the worst impacts of Taliban repression by offering support, solidarity, and essential services. On the ground, our members have cultivated entry points via local religious, tribal, or community leaders, and partnered with civic space, enabling them to maintain a degree of civic space and to promote and protect basic human rights. And it is this tenacity and this persistence that will continue, and no state will ever be able to tear it down. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very, very much for that inspiring set of remarks. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Carrie Walling. I'm the director of the Human Rights Program in the Institute for Global Studies here in the College of Liberal Arts. And tonight's conversation on the protection of human rights defenders fits squarely within the spirit and the purpose both of the Human Rights Program as well as the Scallen Lecture series, which is really to create a venue for important conversations and training on human rights and to amplify the voices like those of Mary Lawlor who helped to safeguard them. So in just a moment, we're going to invite you to join us in this conversation. We're going to do this in two different ways. Along both aisles, we have student volunteers who have microphones, and if you have a question you'd like to ask, you'll simply raise your hand high so they can see you, and you'd be welcome to ask that question. We also have students who have note cards and pens, and if you prefer to write a question down, feel welcome to do that. Pass that to that aisle, and that question will also be read. So thank you. We look forward to having you in the conversation. Before we move to that, I do want to note that many of us come to human rights with very strong emotions, with very personal lived experience, and deeply held beliefs. And so we ask everyone to commit to respectful listening as we create a space for respect and dialogue. So please be gracious and kind with one another and treat each other with that kind of dignity and humanity that we're all so equally deserving of. And so I'm going to invite you to go ahead and gather your thoughts, and while we do that, I'll open with a question. So many people in the audience here, this will be the first time that they've listened to a UN Special Rapporteur. What does that mean? What is your role, and how should they understand what you do in the UN system?
Well, it's working, okay, right. So the UN Special Rapporteurs are appointed by the UN Human Rights Council. Essentially, it is a voluntary position, and you have a term of 3 years, which is extended for another 3 years. The way you go about getting elected, hopefully, is you have an interview with a member state from each of the 5 regions. A short list is produced, and then the president of the UN Human Rights Council goes around all the regional groupings and then ends up picking somebody. So the rapporteurs belong to what is called the special procedure system, which is the independent, non-staff part of the UN. And then we all have our own specialities, minus human rights defenders, but you'll find rapporteurs on anything from poverty or violence against women, or working group on discrimination against women, or sexual orientation and gender identity, and or it can be torture, or it can be freedom of expression, or it can be freedom of assembly and association. So people are appointed for all sorts of different things. And then you also have country mandates. So there's one on Burundi, for example. There's one on Myanmar. There's one on the occupied territories. There's one on Eritrea. So, and then the system as a whole, the way it works is we have tools, and the main tool is communications. And these are formal letters that you write to the oppressive government about something or other. In my case, I take a people-centered approach. I raise cases of human rights defenders who have been killed or disappeared, or who've been sentenced to long-term imprisonment, or who have been attacked online or offline, or whatever the violation is. And the government gets 60 days to respond to that letter of allegation. Sometimes they respond, sometimes they don't respond, And sometimes the ones that do respond just go give a blah-de-blah response. Sometimes they give a good response, you learn something. So that is the main tool. But apart from that, like Ed, who is my senior advisor here, and I and the others that I have with me, we have spoken to over 2,000 human rights defenders from all over the world since I started. And we've also followed up on all the cases that we've taken up, over 600 of them ourselves, not to mention the ones where we join other rapporteurs if there's a human rights defender element in their communication. And finally, you know, I'm forever talking to governments, trying to persuade them to improve their protection of human rights defenders, even to recognize that these people are defending the rights of others, because people like China say there's no universally agreed definition of human rights defenders, for example. And I've spoken to about 80 governments in person on that, and I also follow up online. So that's what the rapporteur does. And then you follow, sorry, last thing, you follow laws, bad laws, where you try and improve the law by suggesting amendments, or you follow negative policies that have occurred in a country and you try and at least redress them a bit. So that's really what it's all about.
Thank you. So I hope you can all see how special it is that we have her here with us today. At this time, do we have questions that people would like to ask? Go ahead and raise your hands.
So it seems like one of the primary challenges of the system and one of its failings is that seats of power can be signatories to various conventions and members of organizations and agree to follow all these steps and then decide not to, and there is no meaningful enforcement mechanism upon the enforcers. What can be done in order to help ensure that seats of power, such as the United States, follow these sorts of human rights policies that either the US has agreed to or not that we should be following?
Well, you're quite right. There is no enforcement mechanism. You have to remember that the UN is a collection of states, and it's driven by the political and strategic interests of each state. And all the power resides in the Security Council, of which the US, as you know, is a member. Russia, China, for example, they can all veto anything. So that makes it really problematic. And although there are temporary members of the Security Council appointed, you know, they don't have the same power. And the problem is then that unless there is meaningful reform of the Security Council, which certainly doesn't look likely, it will continue in its really deficient way. I do think, however, that, you know, the passing of the development of in the body of international standards and human rights law has been extremely important for the world as a whole, because it, even if they don't implement what they have ratified or signed, it is a constant reminder to them of their failings. And all the states, regardless, will do whatever they can to try and preserve their reputation. I mean, I get states getting in touch with me to try and change a word in a press release or a heading, or to try and persuade me that somebody isn't a human rights defender. So it just shows the lengths to which they will go to. But really, the UN system needs a root and branch reform. But it's all we have, and if we didn't have it, we'd have nothing. No?
Should I go ahead? Go ahead. Thank you, Ms. Lawlor, for coming. My name is Barbara Fry, and I was part of this program for many years, and I have great admiration for your work, and I'm just so delighted that you're here. One of the things in response to this failure, this weakness in the international system, is the importance of private organizations and non-governmental organizations in putting pressure on governments or trying to use creative efforts to defend the defenders. And I know a lot of our students are interested in really thinking about creative ideas for protecting people who are most vulnerable in this country and in other countries. And I'm wondering if you could reflect a little bit on your work with Frontline Defenders and other organizations that you've seen or been affiliated with, and give us some sense of what are some of the best ways that we can be thinking about protecting people in really difficult times.
Yeah, I mean, I always think that the easiest way to think about it is what would you do if it was a family member or somebody you loved? You just try and do everything you could. And so when I set up Frontline Defenders, we listened very carefully to what human rights defenders said they needed. They needed solidarity, they needed support, they needed protection, they needed training. So we built a program around what they said that they needed. We were led by the defenders themselves. So it's a mixture of advocacy on their behalf, training in physical and digital security, networking, because people go to their networks when they are in danger. They go to those they trust. They go to those that show them solidarity, just as in a family or with a collection of friends. If you were in trouble, that would be your first port of call. So it's really important that there are networks of support. So I would say to students, you know, it's very easy to get involved in human rights work. And it doesn't mean joining an organization or, you know, per se. While you're in university, you can just look at your own community and see where the needs are and volunteer for a while. And as you go through your program, it'll become clear to you where your main interest is. Is it, you know, domestic violence? Is it long-term imprisonment of human rights defenders, for example? Is it protection of migrants and refugees and people who are being lifted off the streets here? What is it that you really are most interested in? And then, you know, get together with like-minded people and brainstorm, and you'll come up with ideas. I mean, we heard even this morning a fantastic idea from a group of LGBT activists, and they have decided, because of all the cuts to LGBT work, that they're going to set up a pharmacy, and that's how they're going to raise money. And I thought that was so ingenious. And ingenious ideas happen when people get together.
Hi, my name is Cece Heinen. I'm actually a student in Dr. Rolling's class, and we've been learning about the Universal Periodic Review and simulating it. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the significance behind the United States not participating, most likely, in their periodic review this November, and what that means.
Well, the Universal Periodic Review is really Ed's baby. And he contacts all the states ahead of any countries. We have a group of, I suppose, 20 states. It's about 15, maybe 20, who have agreed to take up cases of human rights defenders every month and to try and pressure the offending government. We usually use it for long-term imprisonment of peaceful, innocent defenders who've been imprisoned for anything from 10 years, which I did a report on this, so I took 10 years to life as the as the criteria. So Ed always gets in touch, writes a briefing for all these states ahead of the UPR, and they usually mention the issue of human rights defenders or a case, and they also take action. Some states are better than others. In fact, the ones that, well, anyway, it's very complicated, so I won't go into it. But when it comes to the US, I mean, look, you know, the US used to participate under the last ambassador in Geneva. The US was quite active, and but is completely disengaged and doesn't say anything anymore. You know, I remember last year asking the 2 young diplomats who were there, what are they supposed to do? And they said, we're just supposed to listen. We're not to say anything. We're not to do anything. We're not, you know. So the fact that it's part of Trump's vindictive strategy, if you want to ask me, in the way that he is pursuing this anti-rights agenda. And this is just another part of it where he's showing the 2 fingers to the UN. That's essentially what it boils down to, I think.
Thank you. All right.
So, hi everybody, my name is Mila Hellfire, she, her pronouns. We were meeting earlier and discussing a little bit about situations that were happening. But I think my question and my curiosity in particular in regards to the position as Special Rapporteur is that I understand that UN Special Rapporteurs are independent, but are still bound by the principles of human rights and non-discrimination. I was wondering what mechanisms exist within the UN system to ensure accountability when a mandate holder uses their position or communications to legitimize narratives that target or endanger trans and gender diverse human rights defenders. And just for the people in the room, the context is that the UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women and Girls has repeated through her reports and pages a focus on sex-based, female-only spaces, amplification of detransitioner narratives, and framing of trans rights as conflicting with women's rights, which is significantly concerning.
Yeah, I mean, the Special Rapporteur on Violence against Women has very little support from, obviously, the human rights movement, and very little support from most of the rapporteurs in Geneva. Rapporteurs come from all over the world, and they have different, I suppose, different religious and cultural values, and you may find some that would agree with her. But in order to try and tackle her lately, we initiated a statement, which you may have read, and we did it quietly and internally, shall we say. And we gathered support from all the rapporteurs that we knew would support, and we ended up getting 47 out of the 50+ rapporteurs to sign it, or working group. So it was a really significant statement, is what I'm saying, because you never get that. And it has been used over and over by states in the Human Rights Council. But the problem is, there's nothing more we can do. Like, we're not a accountability body. You know, as special rapporteurs, we try as far as we can, using the tools that we can and the mandates we hold to advance rights. But you will always get, because the UN is such a political system, you will always get some rapporteurs who are there, who are what we would call gongo rapporteurs, or who come from a very, how would you put it, from a position where they their idea of international human rights framework is different, or or some of them aren't even interested. They just want to see it on their CV, you know. So it isn't a perfect system either, you know. But that's all. We can only keep enunciating ourselves and through our statements.
Go ahead, Madeline.
We have a question from our note cards. How critical has the United States been in encouraging and enforcing human rights around the world, and to what degree has the current administration retreated from that role?
Right, well, people think the United States has always been very good, but in fact they haven't been so good. You know, like in the 70s, they were there trying to do regime change in many countries. And along the way, you know, they spoke the language, but they didn't implement all the standards that they should. However, that being said, they were very important, because if they were persuaded about, you know, the importance of standing up for human rights, they could be very persuasive. And certainly they were persuasive in many situations, not all situations, but persuasive in many situations. And what has happened now is they've completely disengaged. Everybody is looking to see what's going to happen next. Nobody knows what that man in the White House is going to do next. And really, the fact that they have cut all the funding, all the State Department funding, all the funding to human rights defenders, all the funding to so many organizations around the world who have relied so much on that funding, is, in my view, disgraceful. And I really don't know where it'll all end. But my hope is that sooner or later, you know, states will stop being afraid of what Trump will do to their political and strategic interests and become a bit braver. But I wouldn't hold your breath.
Thank you. We have a question here.
Hi, Ms. Lawlor. Thank you for being here today. I have a question about human rights defenders and how you define who is under your scope. Because you said that in some countries, even using words like dignity and freedom will, you know, label you as a human rights defender. And then you have frontline workers, right? So my first question is, who do you deem under your scope as rapporteur, as a human rights defender? And would you consider an increased focus on maybe behind the scenes protections for behind the scenes human rights defenders, now that we're seeing domestic crackdowns more in NGOs and you know, officials coming into offices and human rights defenders that are doing more research and advocacy being targeted?
Yeah, I mean, I use the UN Declaration on Human Rights Defenders, which says that, you know, any individual or organization who works to promote human rights and fundamental freedoms peacefully is a human rights defender. Now, where it comes down to is interpretation. And, you know, I would say not all protesters are human rights defenders. For me, I have to go into each case and check it out and see, you know, was their work motivated by trying to improve the rights of others and exercising their own right to defend rights. So sometimes you can have people who have a dual I was going to say nationality, a dual function. So you can have journalists who could be writing a lot of the time about just common and garden things. And then one day somebody writes a piece about about corruption in the government and becomes targeted because of that. Well, then they're a human rights defender, even though they haven't worked in an NGO. Anyone can be a human rights defender. It can be a lawyer, it can be an engineer, it can be somebody in an NGO, it can be an individual, it can be a journalist, trade unionist, you name it. As long as they have been peacefully working for the rights of others or exposing human rights violations, well then, they are human rights defenders. But you really need to go into it, on a case-by-case basis to be truly sure. And I never take up anyone that obviously uses violence or even promotes any kind of violence, even if they don't use it themselves. I don't take up I don't take up elected parliamentarians or people who've been elected, because it's too blurry. Even if they are the best, even if they got into politics to protect human rights, it just is blurry, and I don't take up anyone of whom I have any doubt, So that's the way I try. But it's not an exact science,
Excuse me. Forgive me if my views are a little bit more depressing than everyone else. I'm still suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder as being a Guantanamo defense attorney, which only ended last winter when our appeal to the Supreme Court was turned down once again. I got to pay homage to David Weisbrod of this university, who helped so much on those cases. But in the course of that, I immersed myself in the study, both the history and the political theory of what was being done there. One person that came to light was Ernst Frankl, a German Jewish lawyer who wrote a book called The Dual State, which received a little prominence, well-deserved prominence, when Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson cited it in her dissent recently. And should almost be mandatory reading for anybody in law school, I would argue, to see what happened in the 1930s and to be able to draw these connections ideologically. And I say that because during my time, I really had to immerse myself in a whole lot of areas of law of war, including the Nuremberg tribunals. And there they studied and reported on the ideological element of what happened in Germany. And so I'm wondering if your reports ever contain any analysis of that. You mentioned Trump and Orban, but they're part of a larger movement, variously called post-liberalism, national conservatism, and they take in a number of countries, European countries, now calling themselves Patriots Europe, et cetera, including Likud, which has joined them just recently. And so you've got this international right-wing coalition, you could argue, all in agreement, and the Dobbs case really showed this, that they're against even the idea of human rights. I mean, Dobbs took, and other so-called conservative commentators take the constitutional law back, argue that the 1789 Constitution is illegitimate because it has a Bill of Rights. They go back to the 1787 Constitution. Seriously, Bill Barr made this argument at a conservative college. So I guess I'm just wondering, do you do any kind of analysis of the underlying political theory, which is I went to the New School of Study after my Guantanamo experience, just to understand better how we could have created such a genuinely fascist legal system in Guantanamo Bay?
So I think the question is about the underlying theory that undergirds your reports.
Well, I think it is the Special Rapporteur on the independence of judges and lawyers. That's her main, she's the main person to look at the legal systems and laws and underlying stuff. I mean, we don't look at the underlying legal system. We look at whatever laws are coming in or have been brought in and how they affect the protection of human rights defenders. And of course we analyze those, but probably not in the way that you would like us to.
So we have a person here in the middle who's been waiting.
We're actually law students in Professor Nealon's class. Excellent. And so I was wondering if you could tell us about one of your major victories or your proudest moment as Special Rapporteur and what you see as your lasting impact.
Major victories. Well, anytime anyone is released, it's a major victory. And especially if it's somebody who has been in long-term detention, because I think that is just one of the cruelest punishments anyone can get. And even in, but we've learned that even in countries like China, where we have many cases of people who are serving 15, 20 life imprisonment sentences, we had a what we call a major victory for us. Well, it was a small victory for us, but it was a major victory at the same time, because there were three defenders. One of them was given access to television and a cell with light, and the other was allowed to see his lawyer and his family and had access to books. I don't know whether that was a third one or not. But if you're serving that kind of sentence and you are, nobody cares about you anymore, because this is what happens with long-term imprisonment. Everyone gives up on them. States give up on them. NGOs give up on them. They really have no one. That's good, you know, to get some little privileges. So those kind of wins are really great. I remember the Egyptian ambassador ringing me to tell me one of the people that we had taken up had been released. That was really good. I'm trying to think, Ed, help me out here. Oh yeah, Ed, single-handedly got, come on, it was you. He stayed up for 48 hours after the Taliban took over, and he single-handedly managed to get, it was altogether, how many was it? 200, including families, defenders, to various countries, mainly Germany. We had some, we didn't have great support from a lot of countries, but Germany was great to us in the beginning. We've written this all down somewhere, but I can't remember it all offhand. And what was the other bit of it?
What do you see your lasting impact as Special Rapporteur?
That I survived it. I mean, it's really intense. And you're always afraid you'll put your foot in it, or you'll use the wrong word or say the wrong thing to the wrong person at the wrong time. Like, for example, I had a meeting with 10 defenders in Gaza about a month ago, on the ground in Gaza. And they were distraught, as you can imagine. And there was a woman human rights defender. Well, they were all there, men and women. And I said I wanted to hear about their day. And this woman, she started and she says, well, I get up and, you know, in her tent, and she goes looking for water and food. And that day she had found no water. She just found food. And she's always afraid when she went out that something would happen to her. And then she looked at her child and she would say her child should be going to school and he should be playing football with his friends in a field. And instead he's hanging around dead bodies in a demolished rubble situation. And then she comes back, she's a lawyer, and then she comes back and she, when they get the food, she sets off herself to wherever the latest atrocity had been, be it a hospital or a refugee camp or a feeding station, and she would document what would happen, because she's trying to be part of, it's the Palestinian Center for Human Rights, and they're trying to build a case with a proper evidence for the ICC. So that's basically what she does, and they, you know, anyway. But what I wanted to say was, they gave out, obviously the UN wasn't doing enough, and where was everyone? And I should have just let them listen. I should have just said nothing. And instead I said, you know, that my mandate was very narrow, and this was all I could do. And I regretted it the minute I opened my mouth, because they just needed somebody to listen to them, you know. Another time I feel I made a bad mistake was when I was on a webinar about slaps that companies put on human rights defenders who are exposing corrupt practices in businesses, and who, you know, who have been who've been monitoring the harmful impacts of business and the mining industry in particular, or deforestation or illegal logging, or whatever it is. And the company imposes a slap on them, which is a strategic lawsuit. So I was on this webinar, and at the end of it, somebody asked me some question, and I hadn't a clue what they genuinely, I didn't know what they meant, because I'm not a lawyer. And I started saying rubbish, absolute rubbish. I mean, it was all about human rights defenders, but it was in no way connected to the question. And I still feel I should have been able to answer that question. I'd be able to answer it now. It was very early on in my mandate. But the legacy is just that the work continues. I did my best. That's all you can do. You can just do your best. And as long as you do your best, you know, I'm a great believer in Bishop Tutu's saying where he says, nothing ever, I don't know how, he had a beautiful way of putting it, but the way it was that nothing is ever wasted. It just goes into the ether and germinates into the fullness of time. You know, it was this idea that the human rights movement is not made up of one person or 10 persons or 10 people or 100 people. It's like a river. It's like my friend Mohammed Al-Rakan. I'm going to just read you his quote because I read it in the General Assembly last week. He's a human rights defender in the United Arab Emirates. He got a 12-year sentence. He's a human rights lawyer. He used to train for me in Frontline. I knew him well. And he got a 12-year sentence in the United Arab Emirates. And his sentence was up, and you know, we were all so overjoyed that he was finally going to be released. And they've given him another 25 years. So, but he said, I am an optimist by nature. I imagine that the future is built on the idea of human rights and its culture. He who does not feel that he lives in a free society that makes him feel equal to others will feel that his humanity is incomplete. There is a saying that in a confrontation between the river and the rock, the river will always win, not because of its strength, but because of its perseverance. And those monitoring human rights in the Gulf region are not strong, but they persevere. And that's what I think the legacy is. The legacy is that everyone along their way does their bit. And all these bits add up. And it's like a river.
With that, yes. And with that, I think that's a really beautiful sentiment that we should end on. As we close this formal part of our program, please join me once again in thanking our special guest, Mary Lawlor, for all the incredible work that she's doing. Thank you. And I do have a few other thank yous that we want to make sure that we share. Again, we're so thankful for this Human Rights Lecture Series. You heard a lot about Ed. Ed, why don't you wave your hand here? All the members of the Special Rapporteur's team. And all of the impacted human rights defenders who courageously share their stories with them as well. And we wanted to also thank our deans and for the tremendous amount of support for human rights that they give us on campus. It is no small thing that they provide an environment which allows me to actually do my job. And I greatly appreciate that, and that's not to be taken for granted in this environment. I want to also thank Amelia Schindler and Madeline Christensen. Hopefully they're still in the room. If you are, please stand and wave so you can be properly recognized. They have done a tremendous amount of work behind the scenes and also facilitating visits with human rights defenders here in the local community and are really the heart of the human rights program, and want to make sure we appreciate all of their work. Thank you to all the staff, students whose work has been essential in organizing, promoting the event, Pat Baylor, Maria Drange, Allison Horkey, our student communications team, all of our student volunteers, members of tonight's program. Clearly, lots of people. It takes a lot of work to bring this together. So thank you to all of you for joining us, making time out to be a part of this important conversation. And we hope what you'll do now is to join us. We have a reception and we want you to build community, continue to ask hard questions, talk about human rights, and thank you for coming out with us tonight. Thank you.